She had one piece of bread left, two children watching her hands, and a dead man's debts threatening to swallow everything he'd left behind. Evelyn Cross had survived one Wyoming winter on sheer stubbornness and bad luck. But tonight, with the blizzard screaming through the gaps in the walls and a stranger bleeding on her porch, survival wasn't the only thing asking something of her. It was asking her to choose who she still was. Like and comment your city below. Let me know how far this story has traveled. Now stay close, because what happens next will change everything. The wind had been threatening all afternoon. Evelyn noticed it the way she noticed most things these days. Not with alarm, but with a low, grinding dread, the kind that sits behind your sternum and doesn't move. The sky above the Bighorn foothills had gone the color of old pewter by 3 o'clock, and by the time she'd brought the last of the wood inside, the first real gusts were coming down off the ridge in long, moaning sweeps that bent the bare aspens sideways. She stacked the wood beside the stove without counting it. She already knew how much was there. She'd been counting everything for 6 months. The kitchen was small and cold despite the fire. The walls of the Cross Ranch house were good, solid timber. Thomas had built them right, at least. But the chinking between the logs had started cracking over the summer, and she hadn't had either the time or the material to fix every gap before the cold came. Now the drafts moved through certain corners like something alive, and the children had learned, without being told, to sleep with their backs to the wall on the west side of their room. Clara was 8, Daniel was 6. They were sitting at the kitchen table now, watching her. She hated that they watched her the way they did. Not with need exactly, though there was need in it. It was more like they'd both figured out, sometime in the months after Thomas died, that her face was the only weather report that mattered. If she looked steady, they were steady. If something crossed her expression that she didn't catch in time, Clara would go quiet and Daniel would find something to occupy his hands with, and neither of them would say a word about whatever they'd seen. 8 years old and already learning not to ask too much. That was its own kind of grief. "Is it going to be bad tonight?" Clara asked. She was working a loose thread on the hem of her sleeve with 2 fingers, pulling it slowly, the way she did when she was trying to sound like she wasn't worried. "Probably," Evelyn said. No point lying about weather. Eat before it cools. The supper was what it was. Beans she'd stretched with water and a piece of salt pork that was more fat than meat, boiled soft. A heel of bread she'd cut into 3 portions. The bread was the last of what she'd baked 3 days ago, and the flour barrel was down to less than 5 pounds. She set the portions on the table and didn't look at the size of her own piece. Daniel picked his up immediately. Clara looked at hers, then at Evelyn's, then away. "Yours is smaller," Clara said. "I'm not hungry." "You said that yesterday." "Clara." Her voice was quiet, not sharp. "Eat." Clara ate. The wind picked up outside, hitting the north wall in a long, rolling push that made the single window in the kitchen shudder in its frame. The lamp on the table swayed. Evelyn reached out automatically and steadied it, her hand wrapped around the warm glass chimney for just a moment, feeling the heat against her palm. Thomas had bought that lamp in Casper 2 years before he died. She remembered him carrying it into the kitchen wrapped in newspaper, setting it on this exact table, looking pleased with himself in that quiet way he had. "Good lamp," he'd said, like that explained everything. "Burns clean." She let go of it. She'd been thinking about the letter from Hargrove's office more than she wanted to. It had come 4 days ago, delivered by a writer who wouldn't meet her eyes when he handed it over, which told her everything she needed to know before she'd even broken the seal. The letter was brief, formally worded. It informed her, in the language that lawyers used when they wanted to sound like they were doing you a favor, that the note Thomas had signed against the ranch, a loan she hadn't known about until 3 weeks after the funeral, was coming due. 60 days. Pay in full or vacate the property. 60 days. She had exactly $47 in the tin box under the floorboard in the bedroom. The ranch had a milk cow, 4 horses, some chickens that had mostly stopped laying for the winter, and about 60 head of cattle she hadn't been able to sell at the price they were worth, because Crowley's men had been systematically underbidding every independent rancher at market for the past 2 seasons. Victor Crowley. She'd been hearing that name since before Thomas died, and she'd been hearing it differently since. Everyone in Larimer County knew Crowley. He had a proper office in Mill Haven, a stone building on the main street with his name carved above the door, and he owned what looked like a legitimate land development company, and he employed half the men in town in one capacity or another. He had the county assessor in his pocket, and from what Evelyn had pieced together from conversations at the general store and at church, he had at least one of the circuit judges as well. 3 ranches in the valley had changed hands in the past 18 months. The Peterson place, Old McCrady's spread near the North Fork, the Halverson family, who had 4 kids and had been working that land for 11 years, had packed what they could carry and left in September. Thomas's debt was real. She believed that. But she'd heard enough, quietly, from enough people, to wonder whose hands that debt had passed through before it found its way to Hargrove's office. She washed the supper dishes in water she'd heated on the stove, listening to the storm build outside. Clara and Daniel had moved to the hearth, Daniel with a piece of carved wood he'd been shaping with a small knife, Clara reading from the single school book they had. The fire made their faces warm and young-looking, and for a moment Evelyn stood at the wash basin and just looked at them. Then the sound came. It wasn't the wind. The wind had a rhythm to it by now, a pattern she'd calibrated to without realizing it. This was different. A heavy sound against the porch boards, not sharp, not a branch, more like something dropping. She dried her hands slowly. "Stay here," she said. "What is it?" Clara looked up. "I don't know yet." She took the rifle from its hooks above the door. Thomas's rifle. A Winchester she'd learned to shoot when they moved out here, and had fired exactly twice since his death, once at a coyote that got too close to the chickens, and once into the air to scare off 2 men who'd ridden into the yard asking about purchasing the land at a price she hadn't asked for. She checked that it was loaded, which it always was, and opened the door. The cold hit her immediately, that deep physical cold that came with real blizzards. Not just the temperature, but the weight of it, the wind driving the snow sideways so that it hit exposed skin like flung sand. She raised one arm to shield her eyes and looked down. There was a man on her porch. He was on his side, one arm stretched out, his coat dark with something that wasn't snow. He'd fallen or crawled from somewhere. She could see the marks in the snow off the edge of the porch where he'd come around the corner of the house, though the wind was already filling them in. He had no horse that she could see. She stood there for 2 full seconds looking at him. She could close the door. That was the rational thing. A strange man in a blizzard, wounded from what looked like a gunshot, the dark stain on his left side, the way his coat was bunched and torn, could mean anything. Could mean he was running from something she didn't want any part of. Could mean bringing him inside put her children at risk in ways she couldn't calculate. She crouched down and touched the side of his neck with 2 fingers. Pulse. Weak and too fast, but there. "Damn it," she said, to no one. She got him inside. He was heavy. Not a small man, even half-conscious and limp, and she had to drag him across the threshold and into the kitchen, her boots slipping once on the wet boards. Clara appeared in the doorway from the main room, took one look, and to her credit did not scream. "Get the blanket off my bed," Evelyn said, "the heavy one. And then I need the cloth strips I keep in the left drawer of the sideboard. The clean ones." "Is he dead?" "Not yet." She got his coat open with some difficulty. It was soaked through on the left side, the fabric stiff where it had started to freeze, and found the wound. High on the left side, below the ribs. Not a knife. She'd seen knife wounds. Thomas had taken a bad one from a fencing wire accident years ago, and this was different. The entry was small and ugly. Shot. He'd been shot. Clara came back with the blanket. Daniel was standing in the doorway behind her, gripping the door frame with both hands, his carved wood forgotten somewhere. "Daniel," Evelyn said without looking up, "go make sure all the window latches are thrown." "All of them?" "All of them. Then come back here." She worked by lamplight for an hour. The wound had stopped bleeding actively, which was either good or meant he'd bled most of what he was going to lose before he reached her porch. She cleaned it with the alcohol she kept in the medicine box, which made the man, even unconscious, flinch and try to pull away. She packed it as best she could with clean cloth and tied it firm, working with hands that were steadier than she felt. His face was perhaps 40 years old, though hard living could add a decade to a face, and she'd learned not to trust her first guess. He had a couple days of dark beard and a cut on his jaw that was separate from the gunshot, like he'd been hit or fallen against something. His hands, when she moved them, were calloused in specific ways. Not farming calluses, not blacksmith's calluses. She wasn't sure what she was reading in them. There was a saddlebag he'd been clutching. She almost missed it in the confusion of getting him inside, but when she went to take it from him to make room, his hand closed on the strap, even in unconsciousness, with a grip that surprised her. She left it. She got him onto the floor near the fire with the heavy blanket over him. That was the best she could do. The bed would have been more comfortable, but getting him there wasn't practical, and she wasn't putting an unconscious armed stranger in her bedroom. He did have a gun, which she removed from his hip and placed on the high shelf in the kitchen. Not hidden, exactly. Just moved to a position where she could think about it for a while before deciding what to do. Clara was watching from the doorway again. "Go to bed," Evelyn said. "Is he going to die?" Evelyn looked at the man on the floor. His chest was moving. His color was bad, but not the waxy, terrible color she'd seen on Thomas in those last days. "I don't know. Maybe not." "Who is he?" "I don't know that either." Clara was quiet a moment. "You're still going to help him. He's alive on my porch in a blizzard. What else would I do?" Clara didn't answer that, and Evelyn didn't expect her to. It wasn't really a question. He woke up at some point in the deep part of the night when the storm was loudest. Evelyn was sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low and the rifle across her knees, not sleeping, but not quite awake either, the specific half-conscious state she'd been living in since Thomas died. She heard the change in his breathing before she heard anything else. The sound of someone pulling back up toward consciousness, a sharpening. She put her hand on the rifle. He didn't move for a long moment. Then slowly, he turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were dark brown and clearer than she expected. He was in pain. She could read that immediately, in the set of his jaw and the careful shallowness of his breathing. But he was present. "Where am I?" His voice was rough, used up. "Cross Ranch, about 9 miles north of Millhaven." She didn't move the hand from the rifle, but she also didn't lift it. "You were on my porch." He closed his eyes briefly, opened them again. "The children, asleep, mine." A pause. "You're not going to hurt them." "No." He said it quietly, without offense. "I'm not." She studied him. "You've been shot." "I know." "I'd like to know how." He seemed to consider this, not whether to answer exactly, but how to. "That's a conversation that puts you in a hard position," he said, "knowing what I know." "I'm already in a hard position. I found you on my porch." A ghost of something crossed his face that might have been acknowledgement. He shifted slightly, and she could tell the movement cost him. He was reaching carefully for the saddlebag. "Don't," she said. He stopped. "I didn't look in it," she said. "I'm not interested in whatever you're carrying, but I'd like to know if I'm going to have men coming to my ranch tonight looking for you." He was quiet for long enough that the wind outside filled the silence, rattling the door in its frame and pushing a thin draft through somewhere above the stove. "Possibly," he said at last. "That's not a small thing. I have children here." "I know. I'm sorry." He meant it, she thought. It was in the way he said it. Not the reflexive apology, but something with weight behind it. "I was trying to reach the Henderson place. I must have gone wrong in the dark. Henderson's is 3 miles east. In this storm, you'd have gone right past it." He nodded slowly, like that confirmed something. "Then I made it further than I thought I would." She studied him a little longer. "What's your name?" Another beat, then Nathan. Nathan Hale. Evelyn Cross. She didn't offer her hand. "Mr. Hale, I'm going to ask you something, and I'd appreciate a straight answer. All right? Are you a lawman?" The way he looked at her then was a little different. A slight recalibration, something assessing. "What makes you ask that?" "Your hands, the way you've been moving, even hurt. And you don't have the look of a man who got shot doing something ordinary." She paused. "Also, that bag. Whatever's in it, you'd rather bleed to death than let go of it. That's not the behavior of a man carrying personal belongings." He held her gaze for a moment. Then, carefully, he said, "Federal investigator, I've been in this county 4 months." She heard the words and felt the particular stillness that came over her when something confirmed what she'd been afraid to think too directly. "Crowley," she said. He didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either, and that was its own kind of answer. She sat with that for a while. Outside, the storm was reaching some peak of itself, the wind coming in sustained rushes now that made the whole house settle and shift. The fire cracked. Nathan Hale lay on her floor watching her with dark eyes that had something in them she couldn't quite name. Not exactly trust, not exactly desperation. More like a man calculating whether he'd chosen right when he chose this direction. "How bad is it?" she asked. "What you're carrying." "Bad enough that 3 men tried to stop me getting here. One of them got close enough." He shifted slightly, and she saw the controlled wince. "Bad enough that if it reaches the right people, Victor Crowley loses everything." Evelyn looked at the lamp on the table. Its flame was steady in the shelter of the glass chimney, barely moving even when the drafts came through. "You need to rest," she said. "We'll talk more when you can sit up without it costing you that much." He opened his mouth, closed it. She could see him wanting to push forward, to say more, to establish something between them before the urgency of the night let him rest. "Mr. Hale." Her voice was quiet but final. "I'm not going anywhere. My ranch is snowed in and so are you. Whatever you need to tell me, it'll keep till morning." He looked at her for another moment. Then he let himself settle back against the blanket, carefully, with the control of a man who'd trained himself not to show weakness. His hand went to the saddlebag strap again and held it loosely. "The lamp," he said. His voice was already getting heavier with exhaustion and pain and whatever his body was trying to do to repair itself. "Do you always keep it burning?" She looked at the lamp. She did. Had since Thomas died. It was habit by now, or maybe something else. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said, and closed his eyes. She sat there in the lamplight and the storm noise, rifle across her knees, watching the even rise and fall of his chest, and thought about 60 days, and a tin box with $47 in it, and the sound of the Halverson children crying as their family loaded their wagon in September. She thought about the fact that she had a federal investigator on her kitchen floor with evidence against the most powerful man in Larimer County, and that 3 men had already tried to kill him tonight, and that the storm that was trapping her was the only thing keeping those 3 men from finding him. And she thought, with the clarity that surprised her, that she was afraid, genuinely, physically afraid in a way she hadn't let herself feel since the night Thomas died. But that fear wasn't the only thing she felt. There was something else underneath it, something harder and less comfortable. She wasn't sure she had a word for it yet, but she kept the lamp burning and she sat with the rifle and she waited for morning. The snow stopped just before dawn. Evelyn knew because she was awake for it. Had been awake most of the night, in and out of a thin doze that never lasted more than 20 minutes before some sound or shift in the house pulled her back. When the wind finally dropped and the air went to that peculiar deep stillness that meant the storm had passed, she felt it before she heard it. The house settled into quiet like a held breath finally released. She stood up, knees stiff, and went to the window. The world was white and completely still. The snow had drifted against the east side of the barn to a height that would make the doors difficult, and the fence line to the north pasture was invisible. The posts just suggestions under the smooth surface. The sky above the ridge was the pale gray of very early morning, thin and clean, beautiful, in the way that things that could kill you were sometimes beautiful. "You've been up all night." She turned. Nathan was awake, watching her from the floor. He looked worse in daylight than he had by lamplight, the pallor more visible, the lines of pain more clearly drawn, but his eyes were alert. "Someone had to be," she said. "You should have woken me." "You were barely conscious." She moved to the stove and stirred the coals back to life, adding wood carefully, not wanting to wake the children yet. "How's the pain?" "Manageable." He pushed himself up slowly, using the wall, and she watched him do it without offering help and without looking away. He was testing himself, what he could do, what it cost him. And he seemed to be someone who preferred to know clearly, even if what he learned wasn't good. He made it to sitting against the wall. His face was a little grayer when he finished. "Manageable," she said. "More or less." Something that was almost a wry expression. She set water to heat. The quiet between them was different from the night before, less wary. Not comfortable exactly, but honest in a way she didn't mind. "Those men who shot you," she said, "will they come here?" "When the storm clears, they'll be moving. They know I was trying to reach a federal contact. They may not know where exactly." He paused. They also know I had the documents on me. They'll be motivated. Crowley's men? Two of them worked directly for him. The third I recognized from the assessor's office. She turned to look at him. Denton? The county assessor has men following federal agents? Denton's had Crowley's money for 4 years, near as I can tell. The office has been recording fraudulent transfers, changing land survey records. Nathan's voice had the flat, careful quality of someone reciting specifics they'd gone over many times in their own head. That's what's in the bag. Survey forgeries, transfer records that have been altered, payment ledgers going back 5 years, and 2 signed affidavits from men who worked for Crowley and are willing to testify. Signed by whom? I can't tell you that. For their safety. She nodded. That was a reasonable answer. How long before your contact expects you? I was supposed to make contact 3 days ago. They'll be looking. He shifted, controlling a grimace. But in this county, I'm not sure who's safe to approach. Crowley's network goes deep. That's why I was going to Henderson directly. He's the only man I was certain of. Sam Henderson, Evelyn said. He's been ranching the East Valley for 20 years. He's been feeding information to the federal office for 6 months. Carefully, very carefully. She absorbed this. Sam Henderson. She'd bought seed from him last spring, and he'd given her an extra measure without saying anything about it, just set it in the back of her wagon and waved off her thanks. She wouldn't have guessed it of him, and then again maybe she would have. The water was heating. She got 2 cups down from the shelf. Mrs. Cross? His voice was different now, careful in a different way, the way someone sounded when they were about to ask something they didn't have the right to ask. I need to tell you what you're holding here, what I've brought to your door. You didn't bring it. You fell on my porch in a blizzard. The distinction matters less than you'd think. He looked at her steadily. The people who shot me will look for me when the storm clears. They find me here. They'll know I had you. She poured the hot water over the dried chicory and handed him a cup. I know that. He took it carefully, hands not quite steady. You should let me leave, as soon as I can walk far enough to… Walk where exactly? In 4 feet of snow with a gunshot wound 9 miles from town. She sat down across from him at the kitchen table and looked at him with the same expression she gave Clara when she said something that had a logic problem in it. Use some sense. He looked at her. She looked back. You're not afraid, he said. Not like it was impressive. More like he was trying to understand it. I'm afraid, she said. I've been afraid since about 10 minutes after I dragged you through that door. That's not the same as being stupid about it. He was quiet. Thomas, my husband, he knew something was wrong with how Crowley was operating. He started asking questions about the survey records when the Halverson property changed hands. I thought he was just being suspicious. He'd always had a contrary streak. She looked at her cup. He died in February. The doctor said his heart, and maybe it was, but he was 41 years old and he'd never had a sick day in his life, and he died 3 weeks after he started asking those questions. She looked up. I've had a lot of time to think about that. Nathan didn't say anything for a moment. When he did speak, his voice was quieter. I'm sorry. Thank you. She said it plainly, without dismissing it. I don't know if there's a connection. I may never know, but I know that man has been taking land from families who worked for it, and he's doing it because he can, and because no one's been able to stop him. She paused. You said you have evidence. Enough to bring the whole structure down. The land theft, the forgeries, the officials on his payroll. If we can get this to the federal marshal's office in Cheyenne. How far away are they? If Henderson can send a rider. 2 days, maybe 3, depending on the roads. She nodded slowly. Then you need to stay here until we can get word to Henderson. Mrs. Cross, you can't travel yet. You'll reopen that wound inside an hour on horseback. She said it with a flat certainty that came from having watched Thomas bleed from a fencing wire cut that he'd tried to walk off and hadn't been able to. And I'm not going to put you outside and watch you die in the snow on some principle about keeping my nose clean. She stood up to check the stove. I've already failed at keeping my nose clean. We'll figure out the rest. She heard him exhale. A long, careful breath, the kind that had more than just air in it. I don't know how to thank you, he said. She turned from the stove. Yes, you do. You stop those men from taking any more ranches, and you start with the one I'm standing in. He looked at her with something in his expression that she didn't quite examine because she had children to wake and stock to feed and a barn door to dig out, and the morning wasn't going to wait for her to figure out what she felt. But she thought, as she climbed the stairs to wake Clara and Daniel, that Thomas would have done the same thing. Not because it was safe or smart or the most practical calculation, but because there had always been something in him, and in her, if she was honest, that couldn't look away from a person bleeding in the snow and walk back inside. She'd married him partly for that. She thought she'd kept some of it in the years since. She was about to find out if she was right. The day that followed was its own kind of tense, ordinary, peculiar thing, the kind of day that looked almost normal on the surface while something fundamental ran underneath it. She fed the children breakfast without explaining anything beyond a man was hurt in the storm and were helping him, which was both true and incomplete in the way that most explanations to children were. Clara accepted this with the slightly too knowing quiet of a child who'd been reading adult faces too long. Daniel asked if Nathan was a cowboy, and when Nathan, propped against the kitchen wall with his cup of chicory, said he'd done some of that in his time, Daniel appeared to consider this sufficient. Evelyn dug out the barn. 2 hours with a shovel, shoulder and back aching by the end, the cold air burning her lungs. The horses were fine. She'd brought extra hay in before the storm. At least she'd had the sense to do that. The milk cow was aggrieved but unharmed. The chickens had huddled and survived, which they always did, which she'd stopped finding remarkable. When she came back inside, she found Nathan sitting at the kitchen table with Clara, who had decided to practice her reading aloud to him, apparently on the theory that he couldn't go anywhere and therefore had no reasonable objection. He was listening with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not patience, not boredom. Something more like a man remembering something he'd forgotten he missed. She stood in the doorway for a moment, wet and cold from the barn, watching them. And the settlers came west because they believed it would be different, Clara was reading, slowly but carefully, finger tracking the line. They believed that in a new land a man could begin again. Clara, Evelyn said. Clara looked up. He said it was all right. Nathan looked at Evelyn with a slight, careful expression. She's a good reader. I know that. Evelyn set her coat by the door. How are you feeling? Better than this morning, which was relative but probably true. She checked the wound before starting the midday meal. It hadn't reopened, which was something. She changed the dressing with him sitting on the edge of the chair, jaw set, not looking at what she was doing. Not from squeamishness, she thought, but more like he was working at keeping his body separate from his attention. You've done this before, he said. My husband had a gift for injury. She tied off the fresh cloth. He fell off horses. He walked into fence wire. He once managed to hit himself in the face with the back end of a shovel. I got good at this out of self-defense. Something crossed Nathan's face that was briefly human and unguarded. He sounds like my kind of man. He was stubborn and occasionally infuriating, and he never once asked for help when he needed it. So yes, probably. She sat back. But he worked like two men, and he was honest, and he was kind to the children. Nathan nodded. He seemed to understand that she wasn't looking for his sympathy on this particular subject. Crowley's men, she said, moving to the stove. How many, do you think? He has 6 men who operate as enforcers. I've seen 4 of them. Shoot, Davis. A man everyone calls Real, I don't have his real name, and a younger one who I think is Shoot's nephew. He paused. Plus whoever was deputized through the sheriff's office. Crowley has influence there too. Sheriff Lamb. Evelyn's voice didn't change much. He came out here when Thomas died, stood in this kitchen, expressed his condolences, asked if I had any immediate plans for the property. She moved the pot. He was very polite about it. He probably was. I didn't know what to do with it at the time. I thought maybe I was being uncharitable. She looked over her shoulder. I wasn't being uncharitable, was I? No, Nathan said. You weren't. The afternoon passed in a charged, suspended quiet. She kept the windows checked. She caught herself listening to the sounds outside, the settling of snow off the roof, the horses moving in the barn, the occasional pop of wood, and sorting them automatically into normal and not normal. Nathan stayed off his feet as much as she could get him to, which wasn't as much as she'd have preferred. He had the restlessness of a man built for action being held still by damage. Late in the afternoon, when the light outside had gone to that long horizontal winter gold, Clara found her in the bedroom. Mama. Hmm. Is that man going to bring trouble here? Evelyn was sitting on the edge of the bed, the letter from Hargrove's office in her hands, not reading it exactly. She had it memorized, just holding it. She folded it and set it down. Maybe, she said. She didn't think lying would help Clara. It never had. Clara stood in the doorway. Is it about Mr. Crowley? Evelyn looked at her daughter. Why do you ask about him? Because Meg Halverson told me before they left that Mr. Crowley was why they had to go. And because I heard you and Mrs. Donnelly talking last month. Clara's chin was steady, but her hands were doing that thing with the sleeve again. And because whatever that man's carrying, you looked at it the same way you used to look at Papa when he was trying to fix something that was too broken. Evelyn stared at her daughter for a long moment. Then she stood up and crossed the room and put her arms around Clara, holding her with the particular fierceness of a mother who has been trying to protect her children from the weight of adult things and has just realized again that she hasn't quite managed it. It's going to be all right, she said. Then, because she owed Clara more than comfort, it might be hard first, but it's going to be all right. Clara didn't ask her to promise. She was too smart for that. But she held on for a long moment, and Evelyn felt her daughter's rib cage, so small, still, under her hands, and thought about 60 days and 4 feet of snow and a saddlebag full of evidence on her kitchen floor. She thought about Thomas, asking questions about survey records 3 weeks before his heart gave out at 41. She thought about the Halverson children, loading their belongings into a wagon. She held Clara a little tighter and thought, not this time. The evening came down cold and clear, the kind of winter sky that had too many stars in it, hard and glittering and very far away. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and Nathan sat across from her, and the saddlebag sat between them on the table. He'd opened it and taken out a sealed oilskin packet, which he'd set down without opening. This is what they want, he said. She looked at it. It was smaller than she'd expected, somehow. When can you ride? Another day? Maybe 2? Can you get to Henderson's in 1 day? If the roads aren't too bad, she thought. The road north goes through Mill Haven. You can't use that. No. There's a stock trail that cuts east through the ridge. It's longer, but it stays off the main road. Thomas used it in summer. She paused. I don't know its condition in winter. It's worth knowing. I'll check it tomorrow. I can ride out in the morning, look at the first section, come back. She said it before she'd fully decided and then felt the decision settle. If it's passable, we plan from there. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to read a little better, the particular quality of a man who'd been operating alone for a long time, encountering an unexpected ally and not quite knowing what to do with it. You keep surprising me, he said. You keep expecting me not to have any sense. She said it without heat. I'm a widow with 2 children and a ranch that's being stolen from me. I've had to have sense for a long time. He was quiet. Outside, something, a horse settling in the barn, made a sound and then was still. My contact in Cheyenne, he said. His name is Marshall Everett. If something happens to me before I reach Henderson, if you could get word, nothing's going to happen to you on my property. Evelyn. He said her name and she felt the shift in it, not formal anymore. I'm serious. If something goes wrong, those documents need to survive. They're more important than... I heard you. She looked at the oilskin packet. And I'm not dismissing it. I'm saying we plan carefully, and we don't plan for failure before we've tried for success. She looked up at him. All right? He held her gaze. Something in his face settled. Not relaxed, not relieved, but something in the direction of those things. All right, he said. She got up and moved the lamp to the windowsill, the way she always did before she went to bed. That habit, that old habit, of keeping the light visible. Then she took the rifle from the table, checked it, and went to the hook beside her bedroom door. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Nathan Hale looked at the lamp in the window, burning steady against the Wyoming dark, and then looked at her. Thank you, he said. I mean it. She thought of Thomas buying that lamp in Casper, carrying it home wrapped in newspaper, setting it on this table. Burns clean, he'd said. Go to sleep, she said, and went to her room. But she lay awake for a long time, listening to the cold silence outside and the sound of the house, and the small, distant sounds of her children breathing 2 rooms away, and she thought about what was coming, the shape of it, the weight of it, and she was afraid. She was genuinely, thoroughly afraid. But underneath the fear, there was something else, something that had been sitting very still for 6 months, ever since Thomas died, ever since Hargrove's letter, ever since she'd watched the Halverson wagon roll away in September, something that was looking at a federal investigator sleeping on her kitchen floor with enough evidence to bring down Victor Crowley, and was asking her very quietly, if not now, then when? She didn't have an answer to that, but she kept the lamp burning, and she waited to find out. She rode out at first light. The stock trail north of the ridge was barely visible under 18 inches of hard-packed snow, but it was there. She could trace it by the gap in the tree line and the way the ground dipped and rose in the pattern she remembered from summers when Thomas had used it to move cattle between the upper and lower pastures. She took the gray mare, who had more sense on uneven ground than the others, and she went slow, testing the surface where the trail cut across a shallow creek bed that had a tendency to hide ice under snow. It was passable, barely, and not without risk, but a careful rider on a good horse could make it through. The question was whether Nathan was in any condition to be that rider. She was back at the ranch before the children were fully awake, and she told Nathan what she'd found over the chicory and a pan of cornbread she'd made with the last of the good cornmeal. 3 miles to the first ridge, she said. After that it opens up, and the footing improves. If you leave at first light and keep a steady pace, you could reach Henderson's by early afternoon. Nathan was sitting upright at the table, which was already an improvement from yesterday. The color in his face was still off, and she could read the pain in the careful way he held himself, never leaning against the chair back if he could help it, keeping his left arm close to his body. But his eyes were sharp, and he'd been thinking while she was riding. She could tell. "Not today," he said. "Your call. But the longer you wait—" "I know." He looked at the window. "Another day. I'd rather be able to stay on a horse than fall off at 3 miles from help." He turned back to her. "There's something else I want to talk to you about." She waited. "Crowley's men will start moving today now that the storm's cleared. They may go to Henderson first if they've made any connection between me and Sam." He said it carefully, watching her face. "Or they may start by backtracking where I was. I came from the southwest, past the Deaver property. Anyone who picks up that trail will eventually come north. Toward here. Toward here." She'd already worked out that part on the ride back. "How much time do you think we have? If they're thorough and they move fast, maybe a day, maybe less." He paused. "If they're not sure I made it anywhere, they might spend time covering the area south of town first. That could buy us 2 days." "2 days?" she said. "Or 1. "Or less," he said, because he was evidently a man who preferred the harder number. Evelyn picked up her cup and drank from it without tasting it. She was already running through the ranch in her head, what it looked like from the road, what a rider approaching from the south would see first, where the sight lines were. Thomas had never thought about the property in those terms, and neither had she until about 12 hours ago. "If men come to this property," she said, "they'll see tracks." "Yes." "Yours coming in, mine going out this morning." "Yes." She looked at him. "How willing are you to lie convincingly?" Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration of what kind of person he was dealing with. "Reasonably willing. If Crowley's men come here before you can move, you're a traveler who got caught in the storm. You don't have a name they'd recognize. You were heading for Laramie, you got turned around, you're hurt because your horse threw you when the visibility dropped." She set down the cup. "The saddlebag is mine. Winter supplies." "I was moving to the barn." He was quiet for a moment. "That puts you directly in the lie if anyone checks it." "I'm already in the lie. I've been in it since I opened that door." She said it flatly, not with any particular drama. It was just the truth. "What I'm trying to do is give us a workable story that holds up to a quick look. Nobody conducting a fast search is going to tear apart a widow's property on a hunch." "Crowley's men might." "Then we deal with that if it comes." She stood up and started clearing the table. "Right now I want to move the saddlebag." He looked up at her. "Where?" She thought for a second. The root cellar. There's a false wall on the north side, Mom. Thomas built it. I think maybe he was planning to use it for something he never told me about. There's about 2 feet of space behind it. You'd never find it unless you knew it was there. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. She could see him weighing it, the risk of moving the documents versus the risk of leaving them somewhere obvious. All right, he said. She moved the bag that morning, alone, while the children were outside feeding the chickens and Nathan was resting. She went down into the root cellar with a lantern and worked the false wall panel loose the way she'd figured out how, 2 summers ago, when she'd been taking inventory and noticed the slight gap between the boards. She slid the oilskin packet into the space, set the saddlebag itself, now empty except for a change of shirt she'd found of Thomas's, back against the wall near the stairs, and replaced the panel. Then she stood there in the cold and the dark with the lantern held up and thought, this is the kind of thing you don't come back from easily. She knew that. She'd known it when she dragged Nathan through the door, and she'd known it more clearly this morning on the trail, and she knew it now with the lantern casting her shadow large and crooked on the root cellar wall. There was a version of her life where she'd left him on the porch and closed the door, and Crowley's debt collection moved forward on its 60-day schedule, and she lost the ranch, and she packed her children up the way the Halversons had and went somewhere to start over. She couldn't say that version of her life was impossible. She just couldn't make herself believe it was one she could live with. She went back upstairs. The day was tense and slow in the way that days before something happens always are. She did her work, fed the stock, broke ice in the water trough, mended a section of fence nearest the barn that the storm had pushed loose, and she kept one eye on the road the whole time. Nothing moved on it. The valley sat white and still under the winter sky, and the silence was complete enough that she could hear her own boots in the snow from 20 feet away. Nathan spent most of the day on his feet when she wasn't looking, and on the floor near the fire when she was. She caught him twice standing at the kitchen window, watching the road with the same quality of attention she was giving it herself. On the second time, she didn't say anything, just set a cup of chicory on the windowsill beside him, and went back to what she was doing. He picked it up without comment. They were, she was discovering, capable of a particular kind of silence together that didn't require filling. In the afternoon, Clara developed an intense interest in Nathan's opinion on the geography of the Western Territories, which Evelyn suspected had more to do with the fact that he was a novel presence than with any particular educational ambition. Nathan answered her questions with a patience that Evelyn found unexpectedly touching. Not the performance of patience, not the stiff indulgence of a man who didn't know children, but something genuine, a man who was listening to what she was actually asking. Have you been to California? Clara asked. Once, a long time ago. What's it like? Big, he said, and warm, along the coast, the kind of warm that feels like it's cheating, after Wyoming. Clara considered this. Papa said Wyoming builds character. That sounds right. He also said any place that builds that much character wasn't doing you any favors. Clara delivered this with the specific gravity of a child quoting adult wisdom she didn't fully understand but had decided to keep. Nathan made a sound that was almost a laugh, then stopped when it pulled at something in his side. That also sounds right. Evelyn listened to this from the next room and felt something pull in her own chest. Not grief exactly, though it had grief in it. More like the shape of grief when it starts to loosen around the edges. That evening, after supper with the children asleep and the lamps turned low, Nathan spread 3 sheets of paper on the kitchen table. She sat across from him and he walked her through it without the oilskin packet. She hadn't retrieved it and didn't intend to until they needed it, just from memory, which was apparently comprehensive. Crowley started in 71, he said. Small operations at first, buying up land at distressed prices, which isn't illegal on its own. But somewhere around 73 or 74, he started accelerating and the methods changed. He touched the first paper, which had names in 2 columns. He found a land surveyor willing to alter boundary records. Small changes. A line moved 50 yards, an acreage number reduced on paper. Enough to manufacture a technical default on a mortgage or make a title dispute look legitimate. Who's the surveyor? Dead. Died in 75, officially of a fever. Nathan's voice didn't change when he said it. The work continued through the county assessor's office after that. Denton took over maintaining the altered records. She looked at the column of names. How many ranches? 14 confirmed, possibly as many as 20 in the wider county, but I can only tie 14 directly to Crowley with what I have. 14 families. She sat with that for a moment. Thomas's debt, she said, the loan from Hargrove's office. Nathan met her eyes. I looked for Thomas Cross's name in the records I have. I didn't find it. But there are 3 outstanding notes that run through Hargrove that I can connect to transfers that preceded them. Men who took out loans and then defaulted within 18 months. One of them, Benson, James Benson, I found his name in Denton's ledger for a payment 2 weeks before Benson's survey came back different than the original. She understood what he was saying without him having to say it fully. They could manufacture a reason for a loan to come due. They could adjust records to make a property look like more of a risk, make a bank call a note it wouldn't otherwise have called. Whether Thomas had borrowed that money was real and irrelevant. Someone had made sure it would be used against her. If the case against Crowley moves forward, Nathan said carefully, Hargrove's dealings will be part of the investigation. I can't promise you a specific outcome for your property, but I can tell you that the pattern you're part of is documented. She nodded. She wasn't going to think too hard about what that meant yet. Whether it was enough, whether it would hold up, whether the legal machinery would move in the right direction. She'd spent 6 months learning not to build on things that weren't certain. How long have you been doing this kind of work? She asked. He looked down at the papers. 12 years. Is it always like this? Like what? Dangerous. Isolated. She paused. Sitting in a stranger's kitchen, hoping nobody finds you. He made a quiet sound. No. Usually I have more support behind me. This assignment went sideways in ways I didn't fully anticipate. He began folding the papers carefully. Crowley's reach is longer than the office estimated. I was told the sheriff was neutral. That was wrong. He's been putting pressure on people for months, Evelyn said. Anytime someone looked like they were going to talk about a land deal that went wrong, Lamb would show up. Just presence. Not threatening exactly, just making sure people understood he was around. The message being that Crowley was watching. Yes, Nathan nodded slowly. That's how it works. You don't need to threaten everyone directly. You just need enough people afraid enough to stay quiet. The ones who would talk, they look around and they see everyone else staying quiet, and they think they're alone. She thought about the conversations she'd had in the past 6 months, at the general store, at the post office, the way people talked around the subject of certain properties changing hands, the way they looked at her when she mentioned Thomas's debt, with sympathy that had something evasive underneath it, not callousness. Fear. People who knew something was wrong and had decided, quietly, separately, each of them alone in that decision, that it wasn't safe to say so. People aren't cowards, she said. They're just scared. I know that. There's a difference. I know that too. He looked at her. That's why this matters, what you have in that root cellar. Because it means they don't have to stand up alone. The evidence does the standing. They just have to be willing to confirm what they already know. She turned that over in her mind. You've been doing this for 12 years and you still believe that. Most days. He said it without pretense, which she respected more than if he'd said it with certainty. She gathered the cups and took them to the wash basin. The kitchen was quiet around them, just the tick of the cooling stove and the faint sound of the horses in the barn. Get some rest, she said. If you're well enough, I want you to try the trail tomorrow. I'll be well enough. We'll see in the morning. She was at the bedroom door when he spoke again. What you said last night, about Thomas asking questions before he died. He said it carefully, not pushing. I wanted you to know that if that investigation opens up the way I expect it to, the circumstances around his death will be part of what gets looked at. I can't promise findings, but I can promise it'll be looked at. She stood with her hand on the doorframe and didn't turn around. Thank you, she said. Her voice was steady. She went to bed. The next morning, she was up before the sky had fully decided to lighten, standing at the kitchen window with a cup in both hands, watching the road. A rider appeared at the south end of the valley at 7:30. She watched him for long enough to be sure he was coming toward the ranch, not passing it. He He was moving at a steady walk, no urgency in it, which was either because he wasn't looking for anything specific or because he'd been told to look casual. She turned from the window. "Nathan." He was already awake. She heard him moving in the main room. "Rider coming," she said quietly. "South Road. 1, as far as I can see." He came to the doorway, moving carefully but faster than yesterday. "Can you see a face?" "Too far still." "Coloring on the horse?" She looked again. "Brown. Dark brown. Almost black, stocky build." Something changed in Nathan's expression. "Davis," he said. She didn't ask how he knew from that description. "Root cellar," she said. "Now, take the saddlebag, the empty one, leave it with you, and stay there until I come for you. Evelyn, if I need help, I'll knock twice on the floor in the kitchen. Otherwise, you stay quiet." She was already moving to the stove, to the bread she'd put to rise last night, working her hands into the dough without thinking about it. "Go." He went. She heard the quiet thump of the cellar door. She was at the stove, flour on her hands, bread shaped and in the pan, when the knock came at the door. She waited a beat, long enough to be natural, not so long as to suggest she'd been preparing, and went to open it. The man outside was broad through the chest, with a heavy jaw and small, close-set eyes that were doing a fast, professional survey of everything behind her before they settled on her face. His coat had Crowley's brand on the left breast, which she hadn't expected. They were apparently past the point of subtlety. "Morning," he said. He had the specific politeness of a man who'd been told to be polite. "Sorry to bother you this early. Name's Davis. I work for Mr. Crowley." "I know who he is," she said. She didn't move from the doorway. "What can I do for you?" "We're looking for a man who got caught out in the storm 2 nights ago. Federal man, we think. He was seen heading north before the weather came in." His eyes tracked past her again, into the kitchen. "Anyone come to your property? Traveler, maybe, looking for shelter?" She looked at him with the expression she'd been working on since she'd seen the rider at the south end. Not afraid, not defiant, just a tired woman being asked a question she didn't have much patience for. "I had a man turn up on my porch during the blizzard, yes. Traveling through from the south, said he was headed to Laramie. His horse threw him when the visibility dropped, and he took a bad fall." Davis's eyes went to her. "Is he here now?" "He left this morning, before first light. I think he was embarrassed about putting me out." She wiped her hands on her apron. "I've got 2 children, and I'm alone here, Mr. Davis. I was happy enough to see him go, honestly." "He say his name?" She thought for a half second, which she couldn't avoid. "Webb, I think, or Weber, something like that. I didn't ask him to repeat it." Davis looked at her for a moment with those small eyes. She held his gaze without staring him down, just ordinary eye contact, the kind a woman had with a stranger who'd knocked on her door. "He have anything with him? Bags? Papers?" "A saddlebag. He took it with him." She tilted her head slightly. "Is there some trouble? Should I be concerned?" "Nothing to worry about." He said it with a flatness that meant the opposite. "Which direction did he head when he left?" "East, I think, toward the main road." She paused. "Is there a reason Mr. Crowley is looking for this man? I'd like to know if I've got something to be worried about here." "No reason to worry." He took his hat off and put it back on, which seemed less like courtesy and more like a nervous habit. "You said he was hurt?" "Took a bad fall. He had a cut on his jaw and he was limping." She was giving him enough truth to make the lie hold. A hurt man, a saddlebag, moving east. Enough detail to feel real. Wrong enough to point them the wrong direction. "I bandaged his jaw for him. He seemed all right overall." Davis looked at her for one more second. She could see him calculating whether it was worth pushing harder, and she could see him also see what she was. A widow alone, children inside, nothing to suggest a threat. The kind of woman you didn't look at twice. "Appreciate your help," he said. "Sorry for the trouble." "No trouble," she said, and closed the door. She stood just inside it for a full 30 seconds, not moving. She could hear her own heartbeat in the quiet of the kitchen. Then she went to the stove and picked up a rolling pin she'd set nearby. Not as a weapon, just something for her hands to hold. And she stood there and breathed until the hoofbeats outside moved away. When she opened the cellar door 20 minutes later, Nathan was sitting on the floor in the dark, with the saddlebag and a look on his face that she couldn't entirely read. "One man," she said. He's gone. Heading east. Nathan exhaled slowly. What did you tell him? She told him. He listened without interrupting. When she was finished, he said, East. That puts him toward the Deaver Road, which goes back toward town. Yes. She reached down to help him up, and he took her hand without arguing this time. It'll take him a few hours to figure out he's chasing nothing. By then I want you on that trail. Agreed. They were at the cellar stairs when he stopped. Evelyn. He said it the same way he had the night before. Not formal. If I don't get to tell you later, that was well done. She looked at him for a second. His face in the dim light from above had something raw in it, something unguarded, the look of a man who'd been working alone long enough that the experience of not being alone hit him differently than it might have otherwise. Thank you, she said, and meant it plainly. Now come upstairs. You need to eat before you ride. She got him to the table and put bread and salt pork in front of him and stood at the window while he ate, watching the empty road. The valley was still. The sky had gone to that pale winter blue that meant cold but clear, the kind of day you could see for miles in any direction, which was both good and not good depending on who was doing the seeing. Clara came downstairs while he was finishing, took one look at his face and said, Something happened. Eat your breakfast, Evelyn said. Clara looked at Nathan. Was it Crowley's men? Nathan looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Clara and felt the familiar mixture of frustration and helpless admiration she always felt when her daughter read a room correctly. One man, Nathan said. He's gone. Did Mama lie to him? Clara. Yes, Nathan said simply. Clara appeared to consider the ethics of this for roughly 2 seconds. Good, she said, and went to get her breakfast. Nathan met Evelyn's eyes across the table. The look between them was brief and had too many things in it to name. Something about children who grew up too fast, something about the kind of world that made lying to dangerous men necessary, something that neither of them had the language for right now. She looked away first. Outside, the road was still empty, and the winter light lay flat and bright across the snow, and the trail to Henderson's waited in the tree line to the east like a held breath. She thought about Crowley's man riding east on the wrong road. She thought about what happened when he ran out of trail and turned back. She had one day, maybe less. She was going to need every hour of it. Nathan left at 8:10. She watched him ride out through the kitchen window, the gray mare moving carefully through the packed snow, Nathan's back straight in the saddle in a way that she knew was costing him. He had the oilskin packet inside his coat, pressed against his right side, the good side, and a direction she'd drawn in the dirt with a stick before he mounted. 3 landmarks, 2 turns, 1 creek crossing she'd told him to test with his boot before he let the horse step into it. He hadn't said much before he left. Neither had she. There wasn't a great deal that needed saying that hadn't already been established between them in 2 days of close quarters and 1 blizzard and a federal investigator on her kitchen floor. What he had said, when he was already in the saddle and she was standing in the snow beside the gray mare's head, was, if Henderson sends a rider to Cheyenne today, the marshals could be here in 2 days, maybe 3, and if something goes wrong before that. Then you have a name, Everett, Federal Marshal, Cheyenne Office. He'd looked at her steadily. Don't approach the sheriff. Don't approach anyone in Crowley's orbit. If you need help before I can get back, there's a woman in town, Margaret Fossey. She runs the boarding house on Clement Street. She's not involved in any of this, but she's known Sam Henderson for 20 years and she'd know how to reach him quietly. Evelyn had nodded and filed it away. Margaret Foss, Clement Street. She was already doing the mental arithmetic of how she'd get to town if she needed to, how she'd get the children somewhere safe, how long she could hold the ranch before any of this resolved itself. Be careful on the creek crossing, she'd said. I'll be careful. She'd stepped back and let him go, and she'd stood in the snow watching until the tree line took him and he was gone. That had been 2 hours ago. She was still watching the road. The problem, which she'd been turning over since before Nathan left, was that Davis would be back. Not today necessarily. He had the wrong direction and a cold trail to follow, but once Crowley's men worked out they'd been misdirected, they would come back to the last place anyone had confirmed seeing the man they were looking for. That was basic logic. They'd come back to her ranch, and the next time they came, they would not be satisfied with a quick conversation at the door. She needed to be somewhere they couldn't corner her. The thought had come to her quietly and with the particular clarity of something obvious, sometime around midnight the night before. I need to go into town. Not to hide. Not to be invisible. The opposite of that. She needed to be seen, in public, in Millhaven, before Crowley's men came back to the ranch. She needed witnesses. Because whatever happened next, whatever Crowley decided to do about a widow who'd sheltered a federal agent, it was harder to do cleanly to someone who'd been visible in town that same day. Harder to make disappear. Harder to deal with quietly, which was how Crowley's operation had always worked. Quietly, in the gaps, where no one was watching. The problem was the children. She couldn't bring them. Not to Millhaven, not for this. If something went sideways in town, she didn't want them within miles of it. She stood at the window and thought about it, and then she did the thing she'd been reluctant to do for 6 months, which was go ask for help. The Donnelly place was a mile and a half north by the main road, close enough that she'd borrowed eggs from Ruth Donnelly in the fall and never properly paid it back, and Ruth had said it didn't matter with the tone of a woman who meant it. Ruth's husband, Frank, had worked the same land for 15 years and had known Thomas slightly and had the kind of careful, non-committal quality that Evelyn had always read as practical wisdom. He knew which fights weren't his to pick. She rode over mid-morning, the children up behind her on the bigger horse, and she told Ruth most of it. Not everything. She didn't say Nathan's name, didn't say federal investigator, didn't put words in Ruth's mouth that could become a problem later. What she said was that she had a situation in town she needed to deal with personally, and she needed someone she trusted to watch the children for the afternoon. Ruth looked at her for a long moment across the kitchen table, and then looked at Clara and Daniel on the bench by the door, and then looked back at Evelyn. "This is about Crowley," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn didn't make it one. "Yes." Ruth was quiet. She had a broad, plain face and steady hands, and she'd been watching what happened to the ranches in this valley the same as everyone else. She'd just been watching it more quietly than some. "Frank's not going to like this," she said. "I know, I'm not asking Frank." Ruth looked at her for another beat, and then something in her expression shifted. Not relief, not agreement, more like a decision made and accepted. "The children can stay, till supper." Evelyn thanked her and meant it, and got back on the road before she could think too carefully about what she was riding toward. Millhaven in December was a compressed, gray-feeling town, the kind of place that looked like it was bracing for something even on ordinary days. The main street ran 4 blocks between a livery stable and a feed store, with the stone front of Crowley's land office visible at the north end like a declaration of ownership. The saloon was open this early. The general store had 2 horses out front. A man she didn't recognize was sweeping the boardwalk outside the barber shop, moving slowly in the cold. Evelyn tied her horse at the general store and went in and spent 20 minutes buying flour and salt and a length of cloth she didn't need. And she talked to Edna Marsh behind the counter about nothing in particular. The storm, the state of the road, how early the cold had come this year. She made sure Edna saw her clearly and would remember she'd been in. Then she came back out onto the main street and stood there for a moment in the thin winter sun and looked at the stone building with Crowley's name above the door. She had not planned exactly what happened next. She'd told herself she was coming to town to be visible, to establish herself in public before the next encounter with Crowley's men. That was still true, but standing in the street with the flour in her saddlebag and the cold air on her face, she looked at that building and she thought about Nathan riding through the snow with a wound in his side and evidence of 14 stolen ranches pressed against his ribs. And she thought about Thomas asking questions 3 weeks before he died. She walked across the street. The office was warm inside, with the specific warmth of a room where money moved, good wood paneling, a proper stove, a desk that cost more than anything in Evelyn's house. A young man behind the front desk looked up when she came in with the expression of someone who sorted people quickly by usefulness. "I'd like to see Mr. Crowley," she said. "He's not available. Tell him Evelyn Cross is here. I think you'll find the time." The young man looked at her with slightly recalibrated attention. The name had landed somewhere. And went through the inner door. She stood in the waiting room and looked at the framed land maps on the walls, the valley rendered in clean surveyor lines that told you exactly nothing about the families who'd worked that ground. Crowley came out 2 minutes later. She'd seen him at a distance before, at the county fair 2 summers ago, at the post office once. Up close, he was older than she'd expected, past 60, with a heavy build gone soft at the middle and the kind of controlled, deliberate expression that told her he'd practiced keeping whatever he felt off his face a long time ago. He was well-dressed. He looked at her with eyes that were sharp in a way the rest of his face wasn't. "Mrs. Cross," his voice was smooth. "I wasn't aware you'd be coming in today. I wasn't planning on it," she said. "But I had some shopping to do, and I thought as long as I was in town, I'd come and tell you directly that I have no intention of vacating my property." Something moved in his eyes. Very small, very fast. "The note that's coming due is something Thomas signed before I had any knowledge of it, in an amount that doesn't reflect the value of that land, through a broker who I suspect has a relationship with this office." She said it in the same tone she'd said everything else. Not heated, not aggressive, just flat and clear. "I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Crowley. I don't know exactly what you know or what you think you know about what's been happening in this county, but I want you to understand that I know a good deal of it myself." The room was very quiet. The young man at the front desk had gone still. "That's a serious statement," Crowley said. "Yes, it is. I'd be careful about making it to people who might take it the wrong way." "I'm making it to you directly," she said. "Which I'd think you'd prefer to the alternative." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze in thought, with the cold clarity of genuine fear working itself into something else. That this was the man who had dismantled 14 families, who had, possibly, manufactured the situation that killed her husband, who had bought enough of this county's machinery that he'd come to believe he was the only weather that mattered. She thought, he's not used to someone standing in his office looking at him like this. "The note," Crowley said slowly, "can be discussed. There may be arrangements to be made." His voice had shifted slightly, not backing down, but adjusting. She recognized it as the movement of a man trying to figure out what she had and how much it mattered. "If you're in financial difficulty, the sensible thing would be to sit down with my office and look at your options. I have a lawyer looking at the note's origins," she said, which was not true but was the kind of lie that could become true. "I expect that process to take about a week. After that, I'll have a clearer picture of what arrangements are worth discussing." She picked up her gloves from the chair. "I appreciate your time." She turned for the door. "Mrs. Cross." His voice came from behind her, quiet and very deliberate. "I hope you're not involving yourself in things that don't concern you. For your children's sake." She stopped. She turned back slowly, and she looked at him with an expression that had nothing performed in it. "My children are the reason I'm involving myself," she said, "and I'd be very careful how you say their names to me." She walked out. Her hands were shaking by the time she reached her horse. Not from fear, or not only from fear. It was the particular physical reaction of a body that had been running on controlled adrenaline and had just been released from the effort of holding it contained. She stood beside her horse with one hand on the saddle and breathed until it stopped. Then she became aware of someone standing on the boardwalk across the street, watching her. He was young, late 20s maybe, with a deputy's badge on his coat and an expression that was not quite Crowley's expression and not quite its opposite. He'd clearly seen her come out of the land office. He was looking at her with the specific quality of a man trying to work out something he hadn't worked out yet. She met his eyes. He didn't look away. After a moment, he crossed the street. "Ma'am," he said. He had a careful, neutral voice. "Deputy Reeves, are you all right?" "Fine," she said. "Thank you." He glanced at the land office door. "You went in there on your own." "I had business to discuss." He was quiet for a moment. Up close, he had a young face with something tired behind it, the look of a man who'd been carrying something uncomfortable for a while without knowing how to set it down. "You're the Cross widow," he said. "Out on the North Road." "That's right." He looked at her, and then he did something unexpected, which was lower than his voice. "You should be careful, Mrs. Cross. This isn't— Mr. Crowley isn't somebody who takes things well when they don't go his way." She studied him. "I know that. Are you telling me that as a warning or as a threat?" "Warning." He said it quickly, like it mattered to him that she understood which it was. "I'm telling you because some of us in this county have been watching things happen that we don't have the power to stop from where we're standing." He stopped. Something crossed his face. If you have a way to contact someone outside this county, federal level, someone who could move on this. She held very still. The sheriff knows who's coming to this office, he said, barely audible. He knows who's filing complaints, who's asking questions. You want to send a message north without it being intercepted? You don't go through the post office here. She looked at him for a long moment. Sam Henderson, she said, just as quietly. Something in his face confirmed it before he could stop it. He looked away and back. I don't know that name, he said, which was also a confirmation. Thank you, Deputy, she said, at normal volume. You have a safe ride home, Mrs. Cross. He stepped back, formal again, back in the official register. Roads are still rough in places. She mounted and turned the horse south. She didn't look back at the land office, and she didn't look back at the deputy, and she rode out of Millhaven at a steady, unhurried pace that cost her more effort to maintain than anything she'd done all day. The ride home felt longer than it was. She was 3 miles out of town, in the quiet stretch of road where the valley opened up and you could see all the way to the North Ridge when she saw the smoke. It was thin, barely visible against the pale winter sky, but it was coming from the direction of her property. She stopped the horse and looked at it for a long moment, doing the calculation she didn't want to do. Ranch fire could be anything. A chimney throwing sparks, a coal spilled from the stove. She'd left the stove banked but safe. She'd done it the same way she'd done it every day for 6 years. She pushed the horse to a canter. The smoke got clearer as she got closer, and she could tell before she turned into her yard that it wasn't the house. It was coming from the direction of the barn, and it wasn't a big fire. And by the time she rode in, she could see that someone had set a pile of old fence posts on fire at the far corner of the yard, far enough from the barn to be deliberate. Not an accident, and not an attempt to burn the structure. Just a signal. Just a message about what was possible. 2 horses were tied at her fence. 2 men were standing in the yard, and one of them was Davis, and the other was the younger one Nathan had mentioned. Chute's nephew, probably, with a thin face and an expression of practiced indifference. Davis had his hands loose at his sides. The younger one was watching her come in with flat, careful eyes. She pulled up and stayed mounted. Her rifle was in the scabbard on the saddle, and she kept her right hand near it without drawing it. What happened to that fence line? She said. Davis looked at the fire without expression. Must have caught from somewhere. Must have. She looked at him. You were here this morning. Came back to follow up, he said. Wanted to make sure you hadn't remembered anything else about that traveler. I told you what I know. Yes, you did. He took a slow step forward, not aggressive, just repositioning. Thing is, Mrs. Cross, we talked to some people along the East Road. Nobody saw anyone traveling through, not this morning, not yesterday. He paused. So either that man went a different direction, or he wasn't moving as well as you made out. She looked at him steadily. The calculation she was running was fast and not entirely comfortable. She was alone, no children to worry about because they were at Donnelly's, but no backup either. 2 men. Her rifle if she needed it, but drawing on Crowley's men on her own property would resolve nothing. It would give Crowley exactly the narrative he needed. I can only tell you what I saw, she said. I'm not responsible for where he went after he left here. That's a reasonable point, Davis said, in a way that made it sound unreasonable. We'd like to look around if you don't mind. I do mind. He looked at her with those flat, close-set eyes. Mrs. Cross, this is my property, she said. You have no authority here. If your employer has a legal claim to make, he can make it through proper channels, which I'm sure he's familiar with. She kept her voice level and her hand near the rifle. I'd like you off my land. The younger one shifted slightly. Davis didn't look at him, but seemed aware of it. You went to see Mr. Crowley today, Davis said. I did. Is that a problem? He wasn't sure what to make of the visit. Davis's voice had gone quieter, which was its own kind of pressure. He's a reasonable man, Mrs. Cross. He'd rather settle things amicably. The note on your property doesn't have to go the way it's going. There are arrangements that would be fair to everyone involved. He said something similar. I told him I had a lawyer reviewing it. He mentioned that. Davis looked at her steadily. The thing about lawyers is they cost money, and they take time. And in the meantime, a woman alone out here, lot can go wrong on a ranch in winter. She heard it for exactly what it was. She thought about what she'd said to Nathan. I'm not going to put you outside and watch you die in the snow on some principle about keeping my nose clean. She thought about how, when she'd said it, she'd known where it was going, had known it the way you know a weather change before the sky confirms it. Mr. Davis, she said, I want to be very clear with you about something. Her voice was steady, and she was looking directly at him. I went to see Victor Crowley this morning because I wanted him to know face to face that I'm aware of what's been happening to the ranches in this valley. I wanted him to know that I have documents being reviewed by people outside this county. And I want you to be clear so there's no misunderstanding that anything that happens to me or my property from this point forward is going to be looked at very carefully by those same people. She watched him process this, the careful repositioning behind his eyes. I also want you to know that I've had this conversation in front of witnesses today. Several of them in town who know I came out to speak to Mr. Crowley. She paused. I'm not invisible, Mr. Davis. I was before, maybe. I'm not now. The younger one had gone very still. Davis looked at her for a long, assessing moment. She could see him weighing it, what she might actually have, what she was bluffing, whether it mattered. Have a good afternoon, he said at last, with no warmth in it. He turned, and the younger one turned with him, and they untied their horses from her fence and rode south. She sat on her horse in the middle of her yard and watched them go until they were small shapes on the south road, and then nothing. Then she got down, went to the burning fence posts, and put the fire out with snow, working methodically, boot after boot of packed white thrown over the flames until there was nothing left but wet, charred wood and a smell of smoke in the cold air. She stood over it, breathing hard from the work and from something else. And she thought, that bought an afternoon, maybe a night. It was not going to hold. Davis had heard something in what she said and hadn't been able to dismiss it entirely, but he was also a man who took direction from Crowley, not from his own judgment, and when he reported back, the direction he got would depend entirely on what Crowley had decided after she'd walked out of his office that morning. She needed Nathan to have reached Henderson. She needed Henderson to have sent a rider south already. She needed 2 days to still be enough. She went inside and built the fire back up and sat down at the kitchen table, and she looked at the lamp in the center of it, unlit in the afternoon light. She lit it anyway. She needed to go get her children from Ruth Donnelly's, and she needed to think very carefully about where they would sleep tonight, and whether this house was the safest place for them, or whether she should ask Ruth if they could stay. She needed to decide whether Deputy Reeves was what he seemed, or whether that conversation in the street had been something else entirely. She needed to figure out how to get word to Nathan that Crowley's men had been back, without knowing if Nathan had reached Henderson yet, without knowing if the trail was being watched. She sat in the lamplight in her kitchen, and the afternoon went quiet and still outside. And she thought about all of it with the particular focused calm of someone who is past the point of being frightened by specific things, because the general situation has become frightening enough to fill all available space. She was not a soldier. She was not trained for any of this. She was a widow with 2 children and $47 and a ranch being taken from her, who had made a series of choices over the past 3 days that had put her in the middle of something much larger than herself. But she had gone into Crowley's office and said what she'd said, and she had looked Davis in the face on her own property and not backed down. And whatever happened next was going to happen to a woman who had not been quiet about it. That mattered. She wasn't entirely sure how yet, but it mattered. She got up, put her coat on, and went to get her children. The children slept at Donnelly's that night. Ruth hadn't asked many questions when Evelyn came to collect them, and then, after a quiet conversation at the door with Clara and Daniel just out of earshot, asked if they could stay through the following morning. Ruth had looked at her face and said yes. Frank Donnelly had come to the door at some point during this exchange, looked at Evelyn with the careful, non-committal expression she'd always read as practical wisdom, and then said to his wife, "Set 2 more places for supper." That was all. Evelyn rode back to her ranch in the dark. She'd told the children she had stock to see to. Clara had looked at her with those eyes that missed nothing and said quietly, "Be careful, Mama." And Evelyn had hugged her longer than the situation seemed to call for, and then let go before she made it worse. The ranch was dark when she came in. She built the fire, checked the root cellar. The panel was undisturbed, the oilskin packet still in its space. And then she sat at the kitchen table and waited. She didn't know what she was waiting for exactly. Word from Nathan, maybe. Some sign that Henderson had gotten a rider south. Some confirmation that the machinery she'd set in motion Crowley's office, the deputy in the street, the documents in the root cellar, was moving in the right direction. What she got at 9:30 was a knock at the door. She had the rifle in her hands before she reached it. "Mrs. Cross." The voice was quiet and known. "It's Reeves." She stood at the door for a moment, then she opened it. Deputy Reeves was alone. He'd come without his horse visible. She couldn't see it in the yard, which meant he'd tied it somewhere off the road and walked in. He was in a plain coat, not his deputy's jacket, and he looked like a man who'd been arguing with himself for several hours and had finally lost. "Come in," she said. He came in and stood just inside the door, hat in his hands. He looked at the rifle and didn't comment on it. "You should know," he said without preamble, "that Crowley's called his men back from the East Road. Davis reported in tonight. Whatever you said when you were here this afternoon, it moved something." She watched him. "Moved it which direction?" "That's the part I'm not sure about." He turned his hat in his hands once. "Crowley's not a man who backs off. He's a man who recalculates. There's a difference." He paused. "He made 2 calls tonight on the telegraph. I don't know who he contacted. The county judge," she said, "or someone in the territorial government." Reeves looked at her. "Possibly. He has people in both places." "How many people would try to interfere with a federal investigation?" Something shifted in his face. She watched him register what that question meant, what it confirmed about how much she knew and what was actually moving. "Federal," he said carefully. "A rider went south today," she said, "to Cheyenne. Whatever Crowley does in the next 48 hours, he's doing it with federal marshals already moving north." She let that sit for a moment, which means anyone who's been working for him needs to make a decision very soon about which side of this they want to be on when it resolves. Reeves looked at the floor. He was quiet for long enough that she could hear the fire in the stove and the wind outside picking up again. Not a storm, just the ordinary Wyoming night. "I've been a deputy in this county for 3 years," he said. "I've watched things happen. Land transfers that didn't add up. Men who asked questions and then stopped asking them." He looked up. "I told myself I was one man and I couldn't change what was already in motion, and the best I could do was not make it worse." He stopped. "That's not really a position. I know that. It's just what I told myself." "I know," Evelyn said. She wasn't offering absolution, just acknowledgement. "What do you need from me?" She looked at him. It was a real question, and it deserved a real answer, so she thought about it for a moment before she spoke. "When the marshals come, and they're coming probably day after tomorrow, I need at least one badge in this county that isn't Crowley's. Someone who can keep things from getting handled quietly before the federal authority arrives." She paused. "And I need to know if Lamb is going to be a problem." "Lamb does what he's told," Reeves said. "He's not brave and he's not stupid. When the federal presence is clear enough, he'll step back. The question is whether Crowley does something before that point." "What would he do?" Reeves was quiet. "Reeves, he has men," the deputy said carefully. "Not just Davis and the others you've seen. He has 3 men nobody in this county knows by sight. They came in from Colorado about 6 months ago. They're not registered. They're not known." He looked at her steadily. "Davis is intimidation. Those 3 are something else." She held that thought without letting it flatten her. "Where are they based?" "There's a property Crowley owns south of the valley. Old mining claim, nothing on it worth keeping. But there's a structure." He paused. "I've seen horses there." "How far?" 8 miles south. Hour's ride." She nodded slowly. "If the federal marshals know to look there, they'd find men they're not going to be surprised by." "Yes." He turned his hat one more time. "I can write down what I know. Locations, names where I have them. The 2 affidavits I witnessed getting filed and then disappearing from the county records. I remember the names on those. I can put that in writing." "Tonight," she said. He looked at her. "I have paper," she said. "You can do it at this table tonight and I'll put it with the other documents." Reeves sat down at her kitchen table and she put paper and a pen in front of him, and he wrote for 40 minutes while she kept watch at the window. His handwriting was careful and small, and he didn't waste words. When he finished, he had 3 pages, and he signed each one and dated them, and she took them and went to the root cellar and added them to the oilskin packet with hands that she noticed were not shaking. She noticed because she'd expected them to be. When she came back up, Reeves was standing at the door. If this goes the way it should, he said, there'll be an accounting of what's been done here. Land returned. Records corrected. That's what I'm counting on. He looked at her with the tiredness of a man setting something down that he'd been carrying a long time. For what it's worth, Mrs. Cross, what you did today, going into that office. Most people in this county have been afraid of that building for years. I was afraid of it, she said. I just went in anyway. He nodded like that was the exact right answer, put his hat on, and went out into the dark. She didn't sleep that night either. She sat at the table until past midnight, and then she moved to the chair by the front window with the rifle across her knees, the same position she'd held the first night with Nathan on her kitchen floor. And she watched the road and the yard and the dark line of the tree line to the south. Twice she thought she heard something, and both times it was nothing. A horse in the barn shifting weight, the house settling in the cold. But the third time, sometime past 2 in the morning, it was something. A horse on the south road, moving fast. One horse, and then, after a few seconds, the sound of it slowing and turning into her yard. She was at the door with the rifle up before the rider pulled rein. "It's me," Nathan's voice, rough from cold in the ride. "Don't shoot." She lowered the rifle and he dismounted, and she could see in the moonlight that he'd made it, but not easily. The way he got down from the horse had something desperate in it, the careful, grinding movement of a man at the edge of what his body would give him. "Henderson?" she said. "Ryder went south this afternoon. Sam's cousin. Fast man. Good horse." He let her take the gray mare's reins and stood in the yard, breathing through whatever the ride had cost him. Everett's office is already expecting it. Sam had sent a preliminary message 2 weeks ago. They've been staged. She stared at him. 2 weeks ago. Sam's been preparing. He just needed the documents to move. Nathan looked at her. His face in the moonlight was gray from pain and cold and exhaustion, but his eyes were the same, sharp, present, processing. "How are you? What happened here?" "Come inside." She got him in and got the horse settled and came back to find him at the kitchen table with his coat still on, which told her he'd used up most of what he had getting to the table at all. She checked the wound without asking permission. The bandaging had held, but barely, and there was fresh seeping at the edge that told her the ride had done exactly what she'd told him it would do. She didn't say "I told you so." She just got the cloth and the alcohol and set to work. He gave her the full account while she rewrapped the wound, his voice steady even when the alcohol made him tighten. Henderson had received him, gotten the documents from the oilskin packet, and made copies, sent the rider south with originals, and kept the copies. Nathan had rested for several hours, and then, because he couldn't stay away from the ranch and wouldn't pretend otherwise, had ridden back. She tied off the bandaging and sat back. "You didn't have to come back," she said. "I know. You could have stayed at Henderson's. You'd be safer. You'd be less safe." He said it simply, not like it was heroic, just like it was a fact he'd decided by. She looked at him across the table. There was something she'd been aware of for the past 2 days that she'd been carefully not looking at directly. The way you didn't look directly at something bright in your peripheral vision because you knew if you looked at it straight, it would change what you thought you were seeing. She looked at it now and then looked away. "I had a visitor tonight," she said, and told him about Reeves. She watched his face as she talked. The adjustments, the calculations, the moment when she mentioned the 3 men from Colorado, and he went very still. "That's significant," he said when she finished. "If Crowley makes a move before the marshals arrive, it's going to come from that direction. Can you get word to Henderson to pass south? Tell Everett to approach from the south road and look for that mining property? If I send a rider at first light, yes. Sam can reach the marshals before they cross the county line." He looked at her. "Reeves's statements, combined with what I have, that's more than enough for multiple arrests, including the county assessor, Denton especially. The land records are the spine of the whole operation." He paused. "And Hargrove's dealings with the note on your property, that'll be part of it." She nodded. She was trying not to build on that too much yet. $47 in a tin box was still $47, and the 60-day clock was still running, and she'd learned the hard way that part of the investigation and resolved in your favor were 2 different things with a lot of time between them. But it was more than she'd had 3 days ago. "Nathan." She said his name carefully, with the intention behind it. "After this, when Everett's people come and the arrests happen, you'll go back to whatever the next assignment is." He looked at her. Something in his face was very quiet. "That's the work," he said. "I know it is." She paused. "I'm not asking you not to. I want to be clear-eyed about what this is and what it isn't." "What do you think it is?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think you're a decent man who fell on my porch in a blizzard, and I helped you because it was the right thing to do. And we've been through something together that has a weight to it." She looked at the lamp. "I'm not going to pretend that weight isn't there." He was looking at her with an expression she'd seen pieces of over the past 2 days, but not assembled quite like this. Something open and careful at the same time. The look of a man who'd spent enough years alone that he'd forgotten what it felt like to sit in a kitchen with someone and not have to explain everything from the beginning. "I haven't been clear-eyed about much in this room," he said quietly. She heard it and let it be what it was. "Get some sleep," she said. "The floor's yours again." He gave a short, tired sound that was almost a laugh. "Generous." "Don't push it." She got up and moved the lamp to the windowsill and went to her room, and she lay down in her clothes because she wasn't going to undress. Not tonight. And she looked at the ceiling and listened to the house. Check it. The second day arrived gray and cold, with high clouds that moved fast. She sent a boy, the Donnellys' oldest, 12 years old and reliable, in exchange for a promise of seed come spring, to Henderson's with a message in the early morning. The message was 3 lines, in the simplest possible language. 3 men, south property, old mining claim, 8 miles, come from south. EC. Then she went about her day. The children came back from Donnelly's at noon. Clara came into the kitchen, looked at Nathan on the floor with his blanket and his coffee, and his general air of a man who'd ridden too far and was paying for it, and said, "You came back." "I did," Nathan said. "Mama said you might not." "Clara," Evelyn said from the stove. "She didn't say it out loud," Clara said. "She just had the face she makes when she thinks something isn't going to happen." Nathan looked at Evelyn. Evelyn kept her eyes on the stove. "Eat your lunch," she said. The afternoon was the slowest kind of tense. Nothing moving, no riders on the road, the valley sitting under its winter sky like it was waiting too. Daniel, who had absorbed the general atmosphere of held breath without being told anything specific, invented a game that involved moving his carved wooden figures in elaborate silence, which Evelyn found unexpectedly touching. At 3 p.m, Nathan came to stand beside her at the window. They stood there for a moment, not touching, looking at the road. "Tonight might be when he moves," Nathan said, "if he's going to move before the marshals arrive. He knows something is coming. He's not a stupid man." Nathan's voice was quiet. "Stupid men get caught early. Crowley built this over 15 years because he was careful and patient. He's going to make one more calculation tonight about whether he can still contain this." He paused. "And the answer depends on whether those documents exist and are in federal hands." "They're in federal hands," she said, "since yesterday afternoon." He doesn't know that. She understood what he was saying. Crowley was working with incomplete information. He knew a federal agent had been in his county and had evidence, and he knew that evidence had been at the Cross Ranch, and he knew Evelyn had been to his office and said things that suggested she was more than a frightened widow. What he didn't know was that a rider had already gone south, that the documents were already with Henderson, that federal marshals were already moving. He still thought he might be able to cut the thread before it unraveled. "If men come tonight," she said, "we don't run." Nathan said it quietly, and she heard the we in it without commenting. "We hold the property and we make it clear that the documents are no longer here. Make it clear enough that it's not worth the risk." "How do we make it clear?" "That's what I've been working out." She looked at him. "The lamp," he said, "in the window. Everett's people, I told them when I was at Henderson's that if they saw the lamp in the cross window and a fire signal from the ridge to the east, there was a problem at the ranch and they should move fast." He paused. "Sam's cousin knows the arrangement. When the marshals cross the county line, if they see both signals, they come straight here." She was quiet for a moment. "You planned this from Henderson's." "I started planning it when Davis came to your door yesterday morning." He looked at her. "I was coming back regardless. I just wanted to have something useful when I did." She turned that over. Outside, the light was going to afternoon gold, and the shadows of the fence posts were long across the snow. "The ridge to the east," she said. "That's a mile from here." A little more. You can't ride it, not with that wound. I know. She looked at him. I need you to ride it, he said. She already knew that. She'd known it before he said it, in the way she'd known most of the difficult things in this situation before they were said aloud, because she'd been running the arithmetic and there was only one person on this ranch who could make a fast ride, and it wasn't a man with a fresh wound in his side. If men come to the ranch while I'm on the ridge, she said. Reeves is riding patrol tonight. I sent word through Henderson's boy. He said it carefully. He'll be on the South Road. That's not the same as being here. No, it isn't. He held her gaze. I know what I'm asking. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who'd fallen on her porch 4 nights ago and had been, in those 4 days, the most complicated addition to her life since Thomas died. Who had brought real danger to her door and also, in some way she hadn't quite finished calculating, the first real chance she'd had to fight back against what was happening to her. If the lamp is in the window, she said, you keep it there no matter what. I will. And if they come before I'm back, I'll hold them long enough. He said it with the quiet certainty of a man who had done harder things in worse conditions, and she believed him enough to let it stand. She went to get her coat. She left at 9. The night was clear and bone cold, the kind of cold that came with stars too bright and air that hurt to breathe fast. She rode the black horse, the fastest she had, and she moved at a canter on the packed main road, and then slower when she turned up the eastern track toward the ridge. Behind her, in the window of her ranch house, the lamp burned. She could see it for almost half a mile on the flat before the track curved and the tree line took it. The ridge was rocky and the footing was difficult in the dark, and she didn't push the horse faster than it was comfortable going. It took her 25 minutes to reach the point Nathan had described, a flat shelf of rock on the east face, visible for miles to the south. She'd brought dry wood tied behind the saddle, already split small for quick lighting. She built the fire with cold hands and got it lit on the 3rd try, and then she stood back and watched it catch. From the south, from a rider on the Cheyenne Road, you would see 2 things, a lamp in a ranch window to the northwest, and a fire on the eastern ridge. She watched the fire burn for a moment, her hands tucked under her arms against the cold, and then she turned the black horse back down the track and rode as fast as she dared in the dark. She was a mile from the ranch when she heard, distant and carrying in the cold, still air, the sound of men's voices. She pushed the horse. She came into the yard at a controlled near gallop and pulled up hard at the fence. 3 horses tied there. Not 2. 3. The ones from Colorado that Reeves had described. The front door was open. She came off the horse with the rifle already in her hands and went through the door, and the scene she walked into lasted only a few seconds, in the way that scenes at gunpoint always compress time strangely. Nathan was standing against the far wall of the kitchen, with his hands visible and his face careful and controlled in a way that told her he was managing both the pain and the men. 2 of the Colorado men were in the kitchen, one with a gun on Nathan, one searching the main room beyond. A 3rd she couldn't see. The man with the gun on Nathan had not yet heard her come in. She had half a second to decide something. Put it down, she said. Both men turned. The one with the gun moved it toward her, and she held the rifle absolutely steady and said, There are federal marshals on the South Road right now. They saw the signals. They'll be in this yard in less than 20 minutes. She kept her voice at the temperature of a woman stating a fact she had no particular feeling about. You can be here when they arrive, or you can leave. But if that gun moves toward me, we'll see what happens. The second man came back through the doorway from the main room. 3 of them. She had 1 rifle and no illusions about the arithmetic. The man with the gun was doing his own arithmetic. Nathan said, very quietly, from the wall, She's not bluffing. The gun came down. It wasn't brave or clean or the way it would have gone in a story someone told afterward. The man just decided the calculation didn't work and lowered the gun, and the 3 of them looked at each other with the specific look of hired men reconsidering their arrangements. And then the lead one said, We're leaving, to nobody in particular. They left. She stood in the middle of her kitchen with the rifle in her hands and listened to 3 horses move out of her yard at speed. Nathan slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor. She could see what that confrontation had cost him. The wound, the standing, the effort of holding still under a gun when every instinct said otherwise. You made it back fast, he said. The horse is fast. She set the rifle down on the table. Her hands were shaking now, properly, the way they hadn't during. "Are you all right?" "Relatively." He looked at her. Something in his face had the same quality as when she'd come back from the ridge, relief and something more complicated running underneath it. "You held the rifle very steady." "I was terrified." "I know. It was steady anyway." She sat down on the floor too, her back against the table leg, which was not dignified and also was exactly what she needed to do. They sat there on the kitchen floor in the lamplight, and from outside after a while came the sound that she'd been listening for without knowing she was listening for it. Horses on the South Road, more than 3, moving with purpose. Federal marshals. She closed her eyes for just a moment. "Nathan," she said. "Yes." "When this is over—" She stopped, started again. "I don't know what's on the other side of this. For the ranch, for the case, for any of it. I'm trying not to assume." "That's smart. But I want things to be different than they were. For the people in this valley." She paused. "For my kids." He was quiet for a moment. "They will be," he said. "That part I'm certain of." She looked at the lamp in the window, still burning. Steady and clean in the glass chimney, the same way it had burned every night since Thomas set it on this table and said burns clean like that explained everything. Outside, the sound of horses got closer. She got up off the floor because there were federal marshals arriving in her yard and she was Evelyn Cross, and this was her ranch, and she was going to meet them standing. She went to the door and opened it, and the cold came in, and the lamplight fell out across the snow in a long, warm rectangle, and she stood in it and watched the riders come. There were 6 of them. Marshal Everett rode at the front, a lean man in his 50s with a gray mustache and the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by things a long time ago. He took in the yard, the open door, Evelyn standing in the lamplight, and Nathan visible behind her, and he seemed to do all his calculating in the time it took to dismount. "Mrs. Cross," he said. Not a question. "Marshal Everett." She stepped back from the door. "Come in." He came in with 2 of his men, and the others stayed in the yard, and Everett looked at Nathan with the particular expression of a supervisor looking at someone who had done the job, but done it in a way that required a conversation. "You're alive," Everett said. "More or less," Nathan said from the floor. "The documents. Root cellar. Behind the north wall panel." Nathan looked at Evelyn. She went and got them herself. The oilskin packet and Reeves's 3 pages. And brought them up and put them in Everett's hands, and watched him open the packet and scan the first page with the focused quiet of a man who had been waiting for exactly this. After a moment, he looked up. "This is sufficient," he said. It was 3 words, and it meant everything. She sat down at the kitchen table. She hadn't planned to. Her legs just made the decision for her. Everett gave instructions to his men in the yard. 2 rode south immediately toward the mining property. 1 went east toward town. Everett himself stayed at the table and spent an hour going through the documents with Nathan, cross-referencing against a ledger he'd brought from Cheyenne, building something between them that she understood was the architecture of an arrest warrant. She made coffee. It was all she had, and it wasn't good coffee, and she made it anyway because she needed something to do with her hands. At some point past midnight, Everett looked up from the table and said to her, with the slightly startled quality of a man remembering someone was in the room, "You housed a federal agent for 4 days and lied to Crowley's men and rode a signal fire up a mountain in the dark." "Someone had to," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. "Yes," he said, "someone did." He went back to the documents. Victor Crowley was arrested at his home at 2 in the morning. She wasn't there for it. She heard about it afterward from Reeves, who had been one of the men who rode with Everett's deputies to the stone house on the north edge of town. He described it briefly. Crowley in his dressing gown, the look on his face when he saw the federal badges and understood what they meant. The moment when the controlled expression he'd worn for 30 years finally showed something underneath it. Reeves said he'd seemed old suddenly. That was the word he used, old. Denton, the county assessor, was arrested the same night. Hargrove tried to flee on a horse before dawn and made it 4 miles before 2 of Everett's men caught up with him on the north road. Sheriff Lamb opened his office door at 6 in the morning and found 3 federal marshals waiting for him, and he did not resist. He sat down in the chair across from his own desk and put his hands on the table and said, "By Reeves's account, I knew this was coming, which was either an expression of relief or of exhaustion or both. Evelyn heard all of this over the following days in pieces, the way you heard things in a small county when something large had broken open. Fragments from Reeves, from Ruth Donnelly, from Edna Marsh at the general store, who had 20 years of stored-up things to say about Victor Crowley, and was now saying all of them in sequence. What she felt in those first days was not what she'd expected. She'd expected relief. She got some of that, but mostly what she felt was a strange, suspended quiet, the particular silence that follows something loud, when your ears are still adjusted for noise and the absence of it doesn't quite feel real. She'd been running on fear and decision-making and controlled adrenaline for 4 days, and now there was nothing to run on, and her body didn't know what to do with that. She slept for 11 hours the first night after the marshals came. She woke up and couldn't remember where she was for a moment, and then she remembered, and she lay there in the gray morning light and felt the weight of her own bed in her own house and thought, it's done. It wasn't entirely done. That was the thing about real life. It never resolved as cleanly as the moment when the marshals rode in suggested it would. The legal process took months. Everett's office worked through the winter and into spring, and the picture that emerged from the documents and the testimony and the land records was larger than even Nathan had outlined at her kitchen table. 22 properties in Larimer County, it turned out, not 14. The falsified surveys went back further than anyone had documented. 3 of the altered affidavits were connected to deaths that were now being reopened as possible homicides. Thomas Cross's name came up in that last category, Everett told her himself, in the same careful, non-committal way he did everything. He sat in her kitchen, the same table, in late February and told her that the circumstances of Thomas's death were part of an active inquiry, that there was evidence suggesting Hargrove's office had been in contact with persons unknown in the weeks before Thomas died, and that while they could not yet say definitively what had happened, it was not going to be left unexamined. She thanked him. She sat with it after he left, and she cried for the first time since the blizzard. Not the grief she'd been carrying for a year, but something different, something that had been waiting behind the grief. The specific pain of having suspected something terrible and then being told you weren't wrong. It didn't bring Thomas back, nothing was going to do that. But it meant his questions had mattered. His stubbornness, his contrary streak, the thing in him that couldn't leave a wrong thing alone, it had mattered, even if it had cost him everything. And the inquiry meant his children would eventually know that their father had not just died. He had been in the way of something, and he had refused to move, and that was who he was. She thought that was worth knowing. She thought Clara and Daniel deserved to know it when they were old enough to carry it right. The Halverson family came back in March. That was the moment that undid her more than any other, more than the arrests, more than the documents, more than the night with the marshals. She was outside splitting wood when she heard a wagon on the north road and looked up and saw Jim Halverson and his wife and their 4 children, the youngest in his mother's lap, all of them looking at the land through the wagon as if they were afraid to believe it was still there. The territorial court had issued the restoration order 2 weeks prior. The Halverson deed was clean. The property was theirs again. She set the axe down and walked to the road and stood there, and Jim Halverson pulled the wagon up and looked down at her with a face she didn't have words for. "Mrs. Cross," he said. His voice was not steady. "Welcome home," she said. He looked like he wanted to say something more, but he didn't say it, and she didn't need him to. She stepped back and let the wagon pass and stood there watching it turn into the Halverson lane, the children craning their necks to see the house they'd left in September, and she felt something in her chest that had been clenched for a very long time open slightly, like a window someone finally had the strength to push up. The Halverson family wasn't the only one. The Peterson property was restored in April. McCready's nephew, who had taken over the claim after the old man was forced out, got the deed transferred back by May. Each case moved at its own pace through the federal court, and each one required testimony and documentation and the specific patience of people who had been wronged and were now being asked to go through a process to prove it, which was its own kind of exhausting injustice layered on top of the original one. Evelyn testified twice. Once in a deposition that Nathan was present for, sitting across the table in a federal office in Cheyenne, where she answered 3 hours of questions about the days at the ranch and what she'd seen and heard and done. Once in a preliminary hearing where she sat in an actual courtroom and looked at Victor Crowley across a distance of 30 feet and said, in a clear voice, exactly what had happened. Crowley looked at her during her testimony with an expression that was difficult to read. Not hatred. She'd been prepared for hatred and could have handled it. Something more like the expression of a man looking at the thing that undid him and trying to understand it, as if she were a problem in arithmetic that should have resolved differently. She looked back at him without blinking and said her piece and walked out when she was done. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix. And she felt clear, the way the air felt clear after a hard storm passed through. Not easy, just honest. Nathan stayed through April. He told Everett's office he needed time to recover, which was true. The wound had required proper medical attention that he'd deferred too long, and the doctor in Cheyenne had spent an afternoon making clear in considerable detail what another week without treatment would have cost him. He healed slowly, because he was the kind of person who pushed against healing and had to be watched. He stayed at the Cross Ranch because there was nowhere closer and no good reason not to, and because Evelyn had not asked him to leave, which was its own kind of answer. They didn't discuss it directly. That was the thing about the way it developed. It didn't announce itself. It was breakfast at the same table and the work of the day and the evenings when the children were in bed and the house was quiet and they sat with coffee or without and talked or didn't talk. And it was Nathan learning, gradually, the rhythms of the ranch, which horses needed what, where the fence line was weakest, how the root cellar kept through temperature swings. It was Evelyn noticing, gradually, that she was not calculating around him anymore, that he had become part of the calculation rather than a variable she was managing. He fixed the chinking on the west wall in February. She came around the corner of the house one cold morning and found him up a ladder with a bucket and a knife, working mortar into the gaps with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had decided a thing was worth doing right. She stood there for a moment watching him. "You don't have to do that," she said. "The drafts are bad on that side." He didn't look down. "I noticed Claire's been sleeping with extra blankets since November." She looked at the wall. She looked at him. "The mortar's in the barn," she said. "Top shelf on the right." "Found it," he said. She went back to what she'd been doing, and something settled in her chest that didn't unsettle afterward. He asked her once, in March, on an evening when the light outside had gone that early spring gold that meant the worst of the winter was behind them, whether she'd thought about what she wanted the ranch to be going forward. Not what she needed it to be. What she wanted. It was such a specific question. The difference between need and want was something she hadn't let herself think about in a long time, because for most of the past year, those two things had been in such different territories that consulting the second felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. She thought about it for a real moment. "I want the cattle operation to be large enough that I'm not calculating at the end of every season whether we made it," she said. "I want Clara to go to proper school, not just the school book we have. I want Daniel to know this land well enough that when he's old enough to decide if he wants it, he's deciding from knowledge, not obligation." She paused. "I want to not be afraid when I hear horses on the South Road." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "That last one's going to take time." "I know." She looked at him. "What do you want?" He looked slightly surprised, like the question had come from a direction he hadn't been watching. She found that interesting about him. For a man who was very good at anticipating things, he had specific blind spots around being asked directly about himself. "I've been doing this work for 12 years, he said slowly, moving county to county, case to case. "I'm good at it. I believe in it." He paused. "But I've been in this kitchen for 3 months, and I've slept better than I've slept in 12 years, and I'm not entirely sure what to do with that information." She held his gaze. "You could stay?" she said, plainly, without decoration. "If you wanted to." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the spring light was going off the snow, and the bare aspens were showing the first suggestions of green at their tips, and the valley had the particular quality of a place coming back to itself after a long time under pressure. "I'd need to finish the case," he said. "Properly. Testimony, final depositions. It'll take until summer, maybe." "I know. And after that, I don't know what I'd do here. I'm not a rancher. You fixed the west wall better than Thomas ever did, and Thomas built the house." Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood. "That's a low bar." "It's a real bar." He looked at her for another moment, and she could see him working through the particular internal process of a man who had organized his life around solitude for long enough that the prospect of not being alone required actual deliberate thought. Clara would be insufferable about it, he said. Completely, Evelyn agreed. She's already insufferable. She'll be worse. Daniel would want to know everything about the federal system. Daniel wants to know everything about everything. You'd be a resource. He was quiet. The kitchen was warm, and outside the light was doing that thing it did in early spring, where it lasted longer than you remembered, like the season was giving you extra time to get used to it. All right, he said. She looked at him. All right, he said again, like he was confirming it to himself as much as to her. I'll finish the work, and I'll come back. She nodded. She didn't make it more than that, didn't ask for more than that, because she'd learned a long time ago that the things worth counting on were the things that didn't need dressing up. Good, she said. The east fence needs someone to look at it before summer. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. I'll look at it. Victor Crowley was convicted in June. Fraud, conspiracy, falsification of public records, and 3 counts of conspiracy to commit harm against federal witnesses, the last of which included what the prosecutor argued was a direct line between Crowley's operation and Thomas Cross's death. The evidence wasn't sufficient for a murder charge, the prosecutor told Evelyn beforehand, and she'd nodded because she'd already prepared herself for that. The line between what happened and what you could prove in a courtroom was one of the hardest lessons the past 6 months had given her. But conspiracy was enough. The sentence was enough. The judge, a federal man brought in from outside the territory precisely because every judge in Larimer County had some connection to Crowley's web, handed down a term that meant Victor Crowley would die in prison. Denton got 12 years. Hargrove got 8. Sheriff Lamb, who had cooperated fully once the walls came down, and whose lawyer made a compelling case for a man who had been complicit but never primary, got 3 years and lost his office. Deputy Reeves was appointed interim sheriff pending an election. She heard about that from Ruth Donnelly and thought it was, imperfectly and improbably, the right outcome. She didn't go to the sentencing. She'd done her testimony, and she was done with courtrooms. She heard the verdict from Nathan, who had been in Cheyenne for the final week of proceedings, and she was standing at the kitchen window when he told her, the spring afternoon going long and gold outside, the yard showing the green that came when the snow finally let go for good. She stood there for a moment after he said it. It's done, she said. It's done. She looked out at this yard, the barn that still needed new boards on the south face, the fence line that was straight where Nathan had fixed it and crooked where he hadn't gotten to yet, the 2 horses in the pasture, the mud and snow of the yard in the specific state of a Wyoming spring that was neither one thing nor the other. Not beautiful in any formal sense, just hers. Thomas asked questions, she said. 3 weeks before he died, he started asking questions about a land transfer he didn't understand. She paused. I used to think that was the worst thing, that it cost him everything and nobody knew and nothing changed. Nathan was quiet beside her. But it changed, she said. Not the way he would have chosen, not the way I would have chosen, but the questions he asked are part of why Reeves started paying attention, which is part of why Sam Henderson started building the case, which is part of how you ended up on my porch. She turned the lamp over in her hands. She'd taken it from the windowsill and was holding it without quite realizing she had. I don't know if that's how things are supposed to work. I think maybe that's just how they do work. One person does one thing and doesn't see where it goes. Thomas didn't see where it went, Nathan said. No. She set the lamp back on the sill. But it went. That was the thing she'd come to, slowly and incompletely and without any clean resolution, over 6 months of fear and evidence and testimony in courtrooms. Not that good things always won, not that justice was reliable or the world was fair or that the people who were supposed to protect you could be counted on. She'd learned the opposite of most of those things. What she'd come to was smaller and more specific, and she thought more true, that a single person doing one thing they believed in sent something forward into the world that they would never fully see. Thomas asking questions. Nathan staying alive in the snow long enough to reach a porch with a lamp burning in the window. Herself opening a door in a blizzard because the alternative was closing it, and she was not, when it came to it, a woman who could close a door on someone bleeding in the snow. None of them had known what they were doing. They'd just done the thing they could do, in the place they were standing, with what they had. That was all it ever was. She thought that was worth understanding. Nathan came back in July, as he'd said he would. He came without announcement, which was characteristic, arriving in the late afternoon when she was in the garden. She'd put in a proper kitchen garden for the first time in 2 years, which felt like its own kind of declaration. And she looked up and he was there at the garden fence, hat in hand, looking slightly uncertain in a way she'd never seen on him before. She stood up and looked at him. "The east fence," he said. "It's been waiting," she said. He came through the gate. Clara, who had the instincts of someone who had been watching adults manage their feelings her whole life and had developed strong opinions about it, appeared at the back door of the house within approximately 45 seconds. She looked at Nathan. She looked at her mother. She said, "Finally," with the authority of an 8-year-old who has been waiting for the adults to catch up, and went back inside. Evelyn looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Evelyn. They were both, briefly, attempting not to smile, and both failing at it. "She's insufferable," he said. "I told you," Evelyn said. Daniel appeared behind Clara in the doorway, saw Nathan, and said, "Are you going to live here now?" with the directness of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned to dress questions up. "That's the plan," Nathan said. Daniel appeared to receive this information and process it. "Can you teach me to track?" he said. "Daniel," Evelyn started. "Yes," Nathan said. "When you're a bit older." Daniel nodded, satisfied, and disappeared back into the house. Clara gave the yard one more evaluating look and followed him. Nathan looked at Evelyn. "You're going to have your hands full," she said. "I've had worse assignments." She looked at him, this man who had fallen out of a blizzard onto her porch 7 months ago and had, in the way of things that happen without announcing themselves, become part of what this ranch was. He was not the same man who'd arrived. He was tired in a different way, and he'd lost some of the specific wariness she'd seen in him early on, the constant calculation of a man operating alone in hostile territory. He looked, she thought, like someone who had set something down and hadn't picked it back up. She probably looked different to him, too. She hadn't asked. She had some sense of it from the mirror and from Ruth Donnelly once saying, with the directness of a woman who didn't waste words, that she looked less like she was waiting for the next bad thing. She thought that was probably accurate. She was still afraid sometimes. The South Road still caught her attention in a way it hadn't before all of this. She still had nights when she woke at 2 a.m. from no dream she could name and lay there accounting for the children and the house before her heart slowed. She still had moments when she thought about Thomas with the specific ache of something missing so long it had become the shape of a room. None of that was gone. She didn't expect it to be. But she'd learned that fear wasn't the opposite of courage, that the lamp in the window didn't burn because everything was safe. It burned because someone kept it burning regardless, and the keeping was the point. And the light it threw was real whether or not you could see where it reached. That evening, after supper, she moved the lamp to the windowsill the way she always did. The summer night was warm and the valley was soft and green in the long light, and the mountains were visible to the west in the clear air, and the ranch was quiet with the particular quiet of a house that had enough people in it. Nathan was sitting on the porch. She could see him through the window, not watching the road anymore, just sitting with the evening the way someone sat when they weren't waiting for anything to happen. Clara had fallen asleep over her school book at the table. Daniel had made it to his bed under his own power, which was not always the case. She stood at the window for a moment with the lamp warm in her hands before she set it in its place. She thought about the letter she'd gotten last week from the Federal Land Office, confirming that the Cross Ranch deed had been reviewed, cleared of all encumbrances, and registered in her name without dispute. One page of legal language that meant the land was hers, that the 60-day clock had been stopped and dismantled, and the machinery behind it was in prison. She thought about Hargrove's letter sitting at the bottom of a drawer somewhere, the one she'd had memorized. She hadn't burned it. She kept it the way you kept certain things, not because they were good, but because they were part of the real account of what happened. She set the lamp in the window. It burned the way it always burned, steadily, cleanly, the flame barely moving even when the night air came through the open door. Thomas had said burns clean, like that was all the recommendation anything needed. She'd thought about that sentence 100 times in the past year, and she still thought it was right. Not complicated, not philosophical, just the simple true thing. She had not become someone stronger over the past year. She hadn't transformed into something she wasn't. She'd been afraid and made mistakes and asked for help when she needed it, and lied when she had to, and cried twice in her kitchen and sat on the floor after danger passed because her legs required it. She was the same woman who divided the last piece of bread into 3 portions and tried to make sure her children didn't see her hands shaking. She was the same woman who'd opened a door in a blizzard because she couldn't not open it. That was who had done this. Not a better, stronger, braver version of herself. Just herself, doing what she could with what she had, in the place she was standing, because there was no one else standing there. She thought that was the thing worth knowing. Not the lesson in the grand sense, not the moral of a story, neat and finished, but the real, unglamorous, quietly stubborn truth that she'd arrive at through 6 months of hard weather. That ordinary people, holding on to ordinary things, a door, a lamp, a piece of land, a child's face, were the reason any good thing survived at all. Not heroes, not anyone special, just people who refused to let the light go out. She looked at the lamp in the window, burning clean and steady into the Wyoming dark. Then she went to sit on the porch with Nathan, and the summer night was warm, and the valley was quiet, and the lamp threw its light across the snowless yard. And somewhere down the south road, the Halverson children were asleep in their own house on their own land, and the mountains to the west held the last of the evening light like something worth keeping. It wasn't a perfect life. It wasn't going to be. But it was hers, and it was real, and it was still here. That was enough. That was more than enough.